So I'm Sean Rodwell, Senior Audit Manager at Preston Reeves, and working in particular with the not-for-profit sector, so charities, academies and the like, and some companies as well, just so I have that angle. I think I've got about 10 minutes to talk to you about budgeting, and in particular why the finance role is so important to be involved in that process. So I'm going to start with why we need to budget, what a strategic enabler is, how your finance role can be important with that, and then who perhaps the strategic enabler or who can facilitate strategic enabling. So why do we need to budget? Well, other than the odd celebrity scandal, the rising cost of living is focusing every single headline pretty much recently. The cost of groceries are going up. I think a Mars bar is now about 80p, so that's the scale of it. Fuel costs going up, energy prices increasing, so people are having to re-look at how they do things. Inflation, I think, at the moment stands at 9.1%, which is the highest it's been for 40 years. So households are looking at how they cut budgets, how they cut back on costs. Companies are looking at how do they maintain their margins or squeeze their margins but don't lose money. And charities need to be doing the same. So we've got some more statistics here from the ONS, and they put out a survey in March. 8 in 10 adults reported a rise in cost of living, which probably isn't surprising. I guess the surprise is that wasn't 10. I'd like to know the secret of the other 2 people that haven't had a rise in cost of living, I guess. The worrying one for me is the next one. So it figures around financial vulnerability. 3 in 10 people couldn't afford a monthly unexpected expense of £850. So that shows you how many people are really living hand to mouth at the moment and are in that financially vulnerable category. They then looked at the most common actions to combat this, and unsurprisingly, most people are simply going to try and cut out non-essential expenditure. So what's the impact on the sector? Well, this graph here shows you the statistics from the Trussell Trust Food Bank, and this is how many people have had 3 days emergency food over the course of a year. As you can see, 2021, during the height of the COVID pandemic, this reached its peak of 2.568 million. But subsequently, it's not dropped as much as you think it would coming out the back of the pandemic. And I expect over the coming year, it's probably going to increase slightly more. So what does that mean? Well, your beneficiaries, they're going to increase. The number of beneficiaries needing your charity's help is probably going to increase. The amount of issues that your existing beneficiaries have are going to increase. And perhaps your existing beneficiaries are going to be in a worsening position than they ever were before. The impact on your employees. So is the living wage going to increase? Either set by the government or just requested by your employees who have cost of living increases themselves? And is this going to make it more difficult to retain and recruit staff for your charities? Volunteers. I'm sure that many of you have volunteers and they're the lifeblood of your charities. Now, they often travel and claim travel expenses to meet your beneficiaries and do the work they do. Is that 45p a mile still covering your fuel costs? There is some talk about increasing it to 60p, but that still hasn't happened. And then similarly, with people looking to cut out non-essential expenditure, will they cut out their non-essential spending of their time so there'll be fewer volunteers available or it'll be harder to recruit and retain existing ones? Funding. Unfortunately, as statistics have shown, donations are falling. Donations very much fall into non-essential expenditure. So I think there was a stat yesterday which said just how much people are donating to charities compared to the prior years, and it is falling off the edge of a cliff, unfortunately. Similarly, local authorities, they've spent a huge amount of their war chests on COVID and other costs recently. They don't have the same amount of money to pay out grants and give funding to charities, so we're expecting budgetary cuts in the coming year. And then, quite simply, the cost themselves to charities, your energy bills, the cost to run a charity, are ever increasing. This quote here was from the CEO of CAF Bank, so Alison Taylor, and she said, and summed it up quite nicely, after 2 years of supporting their communities throughout the pandemic, they are also having to find funds to pay higher costs. With tightening household budgets impacting donations, there is a perfect storm facing the sector. Not exactly good news. So we move on to what are strategic enablers. So typically you think that's a person within your organisation. That isn't the case. It's not the strategic plan, it's not the person who wrote your charity strategy. Strategic enablers are the elements of your business or your charity which allow you to achieve your strategy or your critical success factors. So I've given some examples there of the elements you would typically expect to be the strategic enablers of your charity. And as you can see, financial sustainability is very much one of those. So how can the finance role play a part in being a strategic enabler? In the past, the finance role was very much processing, back office work, reconciliations, preparing the reports that went to someone else to make the decisions. But now, 2022, that's very much changed. The finance role is a key decision maker now. They are very much part of your business. They work end to end in your business, making decisions, leading from the front and setting the tone for your charity. How is this? So, as I said, they've got an end-to-end role. They speak to your beneficiaries, they speak to your staff, they speak to your trustees, they speak to everyone throughout the charity. They have regular touch points across all of the charity, which not everyone has. They're very much involved with the decision making. There's very few decisions in a charity that don't involve finance. Finance often is the yes and no that impacts decisions. There's also more ability now to create value. So it's not a case of just processing, producing reports. Actually, you get to look at processes. How can we do things better? How can we generate more money for the charity? How can we do more for our beneficiaries? I'll probably get shot down, but I'd say that finance people have more time now through automation of processes. Now, I guess it's not more time, but more time to do things more productively, to better spend their time, thinking about higher end, higher level work, quality work, rather than your arduous tasks. You look at data collection, data processing, and all those sorts of interactions can be done by AI now. And then very much the finance role are key to successful budgeting. So why is budgeting so important for charities? Well, at the top of the list, it deals with uncertainty. We're in uncertain times and you want to set a budget so you can prepare for the future and limit the number of uncertainties. It also creates a benchmark for financial measurement so you can measure your performance against a particular budget. It also tries to eliminate inefficiencies. So when you're looking at a charity's resources at an early stage, you can promote effective use of those resources. It's also the earliest point where you can look at financial risks. So when you're looking at your budget, you're looking to the future. Are there any risky areas? Is there anything on the horizon that's particularly scary coming out of your budgeting? Unsurprisingly, many funders now want budgets as part of funding applications. So they want your accounts, which are historical information, but they want to know, is the charity going to be surviving in a year's time? If I give this charity some money, is it now going to cease to exist a year, 2 years, 3 years down the line? So they want to know that you're doing budgeting and submitting them as part of your fund applications and having those discussions. It also encourages innovation and advancement of working practices. So it makes sure you're not standing still. What can we do differently? What can we do to cut costs? What can we do more efficiently? Which then gives you opportunities for growth, transformation. There's an awful lot of guidance and advice around budgeting, in particular for charities, but it always comes back to these 5 key questions. So, what are the charity's key objectives? What work needs to be performed to achieve these objectives? What resources are needed to do this work? How much will these resources cost? And then how will these be funded? The top 2 are probably for the trustees, for the management to decide, but the bottom 3, certainly the finance role, are going to be very dependent on. So, budgeting methods, and I could have listed about 100 different budgeting methods online that you could adopt, but these are the 4 main ones that charities tend to apply and the ones we'd expect you to use. So incremental, I'd imagine most of the room probably adopt or have adopted in the past. That's simply looking at your prior year budget or your prior actual and adding on 5 or 10% or deducting 5 or 10% depending on what mood you're in on that day when you're doing the budget. It's quick, it's simple, it's easy to understand, but it's not the most effective. If last year's figures weren't accurate, you're basing next year's budget on figures that weren't particularly accurate. If last year's figures had slack in them, you're building your budget based on figures that had slack in them. So it's ignoring all external factors. Something might have happened in the coming year that you should have completely disregarded last year's budget, but you're using that as your base. Activity-based, that's more of a top-down approach and more fitting with charities. So that looks at departments, so perhaps a charity's activities, a charity's projects. You target income resources at a set level, or perhaps projects at a set level, And then you say, to deliver these projects, we're going to have to do X amount of work. We're going to have to spend this much money to achieve this. That means that you're associating your costs to your activities, to your projects, far more what a charity would be doing. And it's output driven, which is what charities tend to do. This gives you greater insight, so you get to see what of my projects, what of my activities actually make money, which of them are loss leaders, and perhaps we should start having some conversations. Do we cease to operate these, or do we try to get more funding? And it's not based on historical data, it's looking forward, looking at what's going to happen in the future. The problem with this is it's difficult. When you've got uncertain income, like donations, if you rely heavily on that, it's very hard to set your targets. And it's more time consuming and requires a lot more data and knowledge. The next one's probably my favourite for charities, but you very rarely see it done, and this is value proposition. So it's very much mindset based, it's not necessarily number centric. So you look at, why is this amount included in the budget? So why is this cost in the budget? Does this create value for beneficiaries, staff, or other stakeholders? So this could link into the ESG work that Dan and Richard spoke about earlier with the other stakeholders. Does it create value in that side? Or perhaps you're collaborating. Is your partner getting value from what you're spending? Then you ask, does the value of this outweigh its costs? If not, is there another reason why this cost is justified? So this one really does prevent wasteful spending. It isn't simply looking at what makes money, it's looking at what delivers value to your stakeholders, which is more in keeping with how charities operate. It gives you a lot more insights, and I think if you're going for a funding bid and you've already gone through this exercise and you can present to a funder, we've budgeted out this particular project and we know this is the value it derives, you can go to them with that proposition and ask for that level of funding. The problem is, how do you quantify value? How do you quantify the value that you give a particular beneficiary or particular stakeholder? So again, it's time consuming and requires more data, but it's one that I'd encourage you to at least think about and try. Zero-based is bottom-up and is one that is probably to be used only in a crisis. This really does remove unnecessary amounts from your budget, simply because you start from zero and have to justify every single expense. Now this tends to be used when you've had a change in management, a change in trustee board, or something's gone seriously wrong and you're having to reinvent everything, and really perhaps you've got a financial crisis and you're having to justify everything. It does change historical decisions and it prevents misallocation of resources, but it's extremely time consuming. And when you've got staff that have been there for a while, telling them to justify every expense is quite demotivating. So I wouldn't necessarily encourage this one unless it's desperately needed. So you've prepared your budget. That's not the end of it. It's not to be filed away and say, pat yourself on the back and say, I've done the budget, that's it, done now. You need to have a look at it, review it, challenge it, present it to management, present it to the board. As part of their review and challenge, they should be looking at it and saying, how accurate was last year's budget? So if last year's budget came nowhere near actual, how much reliance can you place on the budget that's been prepared this year? That's what we do as auditors. So when you present a budget to us, we will look at last year's budget, compare it to your results last year, and if we know that your budgets are historically inaccurate, then we place very little reliance on what you present to us for the coming year. So that's what I would encourage trustees and finance people to do. You should forecast as well. So throughout the year, compare it to how you're actually doing. And then perhaps when you get 3 months through the year, have 3 months worth of actual results and a 9-month budgeted to see where you're going to finish at the end of the year. Perform sensitivity analysis on the budget. So if costs increase by 10%, what would it look like? If income dropped by 5%, what would it look like? Consider those points. And then if something changes, don't just stick with the budget and accept it as inaccurate. You can flex the budget, you can adjust it in year. There's no point just keep saying, oh, that changed, so the budget's inaccurate. Actually adjust it in year. It's not just got to be an annual exercise. Some other points to consider. So cash flow, and this image here is a phrase often coined by corporates, but I'd change it slightly. It would be, income is vanity, surplus is sanity, but cash is king. So this means just because you're budgeting a surplus, that doesn't necessarily mean a cash surplus. So alongside your standard budget, you should look at cash flow forecasting. Are there any points in the year where perhaps funding is received later than the expenditure, when you'd have a cash shortfall? Or perhaps there's opportunities to invest cash. Perhaps your charity is really lucky and you've got excess cash. Could you invest that and use it better? The next point is one that I think has become more prevalent, and it's full cost recovery. And this is making sure that when you submit bids and when you look at costing projects and activities, you're allocating a fair proportion of all of your overheads. So when you're looking to get funding for a particular activity, don't just look at the direct costs. Look at, actually, should we be charging CEO salaries, fundraising costs, regulation costs, and other overheads to each of these? Because otherwise, you're not covering your overheads and your charity can run at a loss. There's no set precedent for how you allocate these, but the typical ways we see are by time spent on the project, floor space, or more commonly perhaps headcount. Any way that you see fair is a fair allocation method, but it's something to consider to make sure that your charity isn't running at a loss and you're only getting your direct costs covered by your funding. Bit on systems, so you haven't got to do manual budgets anymore, it hasn't got to be by spreadsheet only. Xero, QuickBooks, Sage, all the major financial software providers have built-in budgeting, and at a click of a button you should be able to run a report which shows your budget compared to your actual results and be able to present that to the board and review that. There's also now applications and add-ons and things that you can add on to your software. I've given a couple of examples here that just go into more granular detail and relate to a bit more activity reporting and project reporting, so it's worth having a look at those sort of things. But if you do like a spreadsheet still, that website, smallcharityfinance.org.uk, has a number of resources on there, so a number of spreadsheets on their website that you can download an Excel spreadsheet, punch your numbers in, and that will give you your annual, basically, budget and then forecast and then put some actuals in, and that will do the job for you. So, in summary, a good budgeting process will help to aid the sustainability of the charity whilst ensuring it's being run effectively and efficiently. It will also help to maximise the impact, focusing on the activities that add value and removing unnecessary processes. Finally, and I think what's the most significant point perhaps, it means you can have proper discussions with stakeholders, which over the coming months are going to become increasingly important to safeguard the long-term future of your charities and the sector as a whole. Thank you.